Hello, everybody. Welcome to part three of reading John Zizioulas, Remembering the Future. I'm Aristotle Papanikolaou. People call me Telly. Here with Jack Pappas and Rachel Contos, who will be back with us soon. Of course, Jack completed his PhD at Fordham, as most of you know, and Rachel's doing her PhD at Fordham as well. So, part three here, we'll kind of dive right in. Just a reminder, and Jack and Rachel, if I forget at the end, please remind me again. But so we have our last session next week, August 6th, Transfiguration. So very, very appropriate for us to finish a book on the eschaton on the day of the feast day of the Transfiguration, one of my favorite feast days, I have to admit. And so remember that there's a separate link for that, as there has been for all of them. So please go back to your original email and look for that link. If you have a problem, of course, you can email me or, but please remember there's a separate link and you have to register for that. It'll be our final session. Again, thank you to Sebastian Press and Bishop Maxime, provided the book for excellent price, and for some international students provided the e-version. So, and of course, it is available in Greek translation. One last plug. There was a special issue devoted to Zizioulas by this wonderful magazine called The Wheel. Excellent, really excellent magazine. I've written for it for this particular issue and other issues. Rachel, I think you've written for The Wheel, right? No, not yet? Okay, well, they have to get you there. So Jack, have you written for The Wheel?
I have not. No.
Oh, we have to talk to Inga. Inga's in charge of The Wheel. So
Be happy to.
I'm going to put this in the chat, the link to this particular special issue. Oh, we don't have a chat for everybody. I think Siobhan will change that in just a minute, and I'll put it in the chat. And again, just questions and answers. Please offer us questions and answers throughout. Right? Why did Zizioulas write in English and not in his native Greek? That's a good question. Excellent question.
That's a good question.
It's mainly because his first academic job was in Glasgow. And as a result, and plus he also, first of all, he studied in the States. He studied at Harvard. He started with Florovsky. So that's part of it. And then his right after that, his first academic job was in Glasgow. And he was very much involved in the ecumenical movement. So he gave a lot of articles, a lot of presentations in English. He was asked to give a lot of presentations in English, and pretty much most of his articles, the truth is, most of his articles were actually presentations that they were then turned into articles. Zizioulas has actually only, there's a lot of translations now and things like that, but he has actually very few monographs. Like, in other words, your monograph is not a collection of articles, but you start it from the beginning and then kind of go to the end. And this is, I think I'm right in saying this. This is only his second monograph in English. The first one was his dissertation. Being as Communion is not a monograph, it's a collection of articles, which was first published in French. Communion and Otherness is not a monograph, even though it contains some new material, but it's still a collection of articles. Sebastian Bress has done a great job of producing a lot of books, but again, all of them are collections of articles. I'm a little bit jealous because as a student, I had to sit there and go through library reserve or interlibrary loan to find all these, but now anybody wants to study Zizioulas can basically just going to find all these books, which is good. And actually, we can remind people at this point. Someone said to me today, as I was talking about, it wasn't Jack and Rachel, by the way, but another PhD student from Greece, said to me that that this book actually is such that, now when you study Zizioulas, I don't know, Jack and Rachel, what you think, but you can actually read this book first.
Yeah.
Before you start kind of going into this stuff in the past. So I think that's right, actually. Right?
Yeah, I think so too.
I think that's actually what we used to all say was the turn is thinking towards the end of his life. And so I asked because really comments by Telly about the conceptual difference between these two books. Well, the truth is, I don't really think. we're going to get to the book in just a second, but it's okay to do these general things in the beginning. I actually don't think he changed much, quite honestly. I mean, I hesitate to say this because I want to make sure people come back for the fourth session, but I'm not seeing like a whole lot of newness here, right? I'm seeing a few expansions, clarifications, seeing some newness in the sense of taking his basic ontology of personhood and relational ontology and communion and applying it a little bit more expansively, I would say, to themes like creation, the fall, judgment, all that. And maybe one of the things that's a little more developed is, the way he's talking about hermeneutics and theology as hermeneutics and so on and so forth. But I wouldn't say that this book has a huge conceptual turn. I wouldn't say that at all, actually.
Yeah, it seems more like a refinement or a synthesis.
I agree. That's a good refinement, synthesis, a little bit of expansion, perhaps, and themes that he hasn't quite developed. Yeah, and I actually think
he was working on this book for a long time.
He had been working on it for a long time.
So this idea of eschatology being the kind of central hermeneutic lens, even if he wasn't writing that, he's definitely been like, even if he wasn't publishing it, he's been writing this for a long time. But I do think I agree that it's more of a refinement.
You can make the case that the eschatological theme is even in the dissertation.
Well, I totally agree with that. And even we're going to get to this ethics as art thing. The stuff that he writes there actually appears in a 1975 article. So, he's definitely stuck to a lot of his basic core themes. And now he's trying to provide that as a framework for applying it to other kinds of aspects in theology, which he's kind of written about. But I think here he's kind of writing about them in a little bit of a more coherent, synthetic monograph form, right? Like in a monograph form. So I hope that's helpful. I hope that answers one of the questions about why he wrote in English and why Zizioulas did his doctoral work in Edinburgh. I'm a little bit sketchy on that history, I got to be honest. But he definitely wrote for English. He definitely wrote in English because his first job was in Glasgow. All right, we're going to kind of do the same thing that we did last time. We're at like 12:07 here, 12:08. We'll probably like devote about 25, 30 minutes to the chapter 2, and then another maybe 25, 30 minutes to chapter 3, and then kind of keep it open and free flowing. I'm going to begin with maybe a 5-minute intro of what I think is the basic core of this chapter. And then Jack will pick up the thread, and then Rachel will pick up the thread a little bit. And but we're going to again keep like we did last time, keep our comments a little bit more free flowing, a little bit more concise. And we're going to kind of do the questions as we go along, like we did last time too. We felt that worked a little bit better. And I do want to, and again, Jack and Rachel keep reminding me, and don't wait for me to say it, but I do. So I'm not going to go section by section here, although Jack and Rachel may focus on certain sections. So, but we do encourage like you to, at least for now, offer questions just on chapter 2. Okay, so just on chapter 2. And then Jack will kind of define the pages that he's going to do. And, again, keep it focused just on those particular kind of pages so we can kind of stay focused on, particular parts of the book. Okay, but we definitely encourage you to keep the questions coming, and we're grateful for your participation. Okay, so, all right, I think that covers it. So look, so for chapter 2, he's taking what he's saying about a relational ontology, communion ontology, and of course, if there's still questions about that, we encourage you to kind of offer that in the Q&A. Oh, by the way, now that we have the chat, no, it's still not. No, it's not available to everybody, Siobhan. So when that's available, I'm going to send a link to the wheel. So, but in this chapter, in chapter 2, he wants to talk about creation, right? And So the core of this chapter, the core of this chapter really is Zizioulas trying to argue for the Christian case that created reality itself is obviously something distinct from uncreated reality, and uncreated reality is God, right? Is God. So you have uncreated reality and created reality, right? Uncreated reality and created reality. And this created reality comes from God, right? God is the one who creates. And God creates out of nothing, right? Out of nothing. And so there's a lot of different interpretations of what that out of nothing means. Just to give you an example, we can get into this more if people want to, but since God is uncreated reality and a kind of existence, right? A kind of existence that's very different from created reality. One way to understand this out of nothing is from God's own very being, which is a no thing. It's not like a thing. God's being is not a thing like a tree or a rock, right? So that's one way to see it. I mean, but we can talk about this more. But the basic point of the out of nothing, which came in Christian, which sort of was hammered home in Christian tradition around the 4th century, is to basically say that it does emerge from God's will. It comes from God's freedom, God's desire to create an other, right? An other than God. God's not bound by necessity to create. God doesn't have forms or ideas that God has to play with and ultimately kind of shape into a kind of reality that's different from God. God creates out of nothing. God creates from God's own will. From God's own will, because God desires to create an other that God can be in communion with, and that other can also be in communion with God. And in that sense, God creates out of love, right? So that's kind of the tying theme there. But since this created reality is distinct from uncreated reality, its destiny as created reality is non-being. Or another way to put it is death. So, in other words, one could say that kind of wired into creation, or another metaphor could be threaded into creation. Part of that thread, or whatever that thread is, it entails death. And death is non-existence, non-being, right? So in a way, what Zizioulas is saying is that created reality by itself is surrounded by, perhaps, or heading towards, use two different kinds of metaphors, non-being. And it's only real hope. It's only real hope for escaping this tragedy of non-being. And it's a tragedy because, I don't know if you all remember, and we'll get to this a little bit with the ethics and art part, but Zizioulas basically thinks that, he argues for a way of understanding the human being, that the human being is ultimately longing for personhood, but what personhood is longing for this irreducible uniqueness, right? To be realized as an irreducibly unique other. But that realization, that longing is ultimately a tragic longing, because simply through the resources of created reality, it can't be realized. And it can't be realized because it always comes up against death. And if it comes up against death, it's coming up against non-being. So the only way in which that longing for otherness, that irreducible otherness, that uniqueness, what he ultimately sees as, or defines as personhood, the only way to really have it fulfilled is through a relationship with an eternal being, which is the ultimate relationship through with God. And this happens in Christianity, as Zizioulas says, through the person of Jesus, by being incorporated into the body of Christ through the person of Jesus. And in so far as we're incorporated in the person of Jesus, we have the same relationship, that same eternal relationship that the Son has with the Father by the Holy Spirit. So I'll stop there, except just to maybe conclude by saying that this idea of created reality having an otherness is really key to Zizioulas' ontology, in the sense that he very much believes that you can't have love without otherness. And that's why love is both the simultaneity of communion, unity, and otherness, uniqueness, irreducibility. In other words, communion needs otherness. You can't have communion without otherness. But you also, and this is a little bit more of a challenging, a little bit more difficult point to understand, but true otherness only happens in communion. So you can't have communion without otherness, but true otherness only happens in true irreducibility, true individuality, if you will. I mean, Zizioulas hates that word, but let's just use it. True individuality, if you will, can only happen with otherness. I'm sorry, with communion. And in that sense, the ultimate form of communion is what he calls divine cosmic communion. When I wrote my book on Zizioulas, I used the phrase divine human communion. So I think Zizioulas is rightly tweaking that a little bit, in the sense of now really asking for divine cosmic communion. And of course, that's what the eschaton is about. The eschaton is about a divine cosmic communion, which overcomes death and non-being. I'll just read one sentence and then I'll hand it off. On page 130, about 3/4 of the way down, it says, the ultimate eschatos, enemy to be conquered, is death. And it is in this, rather than divine rule over the principalities and powers, that we must seek the quintessence of eschatology. The abolishment of death is not simply an aspect of the divine rule, it is the ultimate of the ultimate, the very eschaton of the eschaton. So, all right, I'll hand it over to Jack, who will kind of maybe amplify these points a little bit.
Yeah, so I think there's a way, right, in which, you could view this second chapter as him kind of homing in on how his sort of eschatological orientation gets maybe cashed out with respect to sort of core loci and theology, right? Creation, the fall, redemption, um, final judgment, eschatology. But I think to really kind of appreciate what's going on in this chapter is really to kind of pick up where Telly did, which is to kind of understand that for him, right, that whole sort of sweep of theology, the key to understanding it is not just in the otherness between God and creation, right? but also the way in which this otherness is bridged but preserved in the communion between God and the world through Christ and the Holy Spirit. And um, Telly did a really good job of laying out uh, how created being is distinct from divine being, right? So just kind of reaching back to what we talked about kind of on our very first day here. I'm using being here as kind of a synonym for essence or substance or nature. He kind of uses these terms interchangeably in various places. Um, and there's a way in saying, okay, well, right, created being is headed toward death. It's imperfect. Um, it is permeated by nothingness. Divine being is perfect, unchanging, plentiful, and so on. And there's a way that when we frame this, I think there's a temptation to kind of think about this as kind of an arbitrary distinction, right? A question that I always get in my classes for distinguishing between God's being and the being of the world is, well, why couldn't God have just made being perfect? Why couldn't God have just made a created being, without this propensity toward nothingness and so on? And I think it's kind of important to clarify that what Zizioulas is saying is that all of these things that he's attributing to created reality, finitude, mortality, nothingness, these aren't things that are just kind of mechanically defined as part of creation. What he's saying is that this goes hand in hand with being created. If you are created, you are by definition derived from, dependent on, beginning at a point in time. So to be derived, to have a beginning, to have come into being, implies, I think, for him, and this is kind of to bring it all back to the whole theme of the book, something about the nature of time as opposed to eternity, right? To be created is to exist in time, to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And to have a beginning, by definition, means to have an end. So to exist as a creature is to exist in limits, right? Imperfection, mortality, all of this goes hand in hand for Zizioulas with the fact that we are created rather than uncreated. And that's not something imposed by God on creation. It's something that goes definitionally with being created. If you're created, you have an expiration date because you have come into being at a point in time, right? God's being as uncreated does not have an expiration date. It doesn't have a beginning.
Yeah.
And so the kind of question for Zizioulas is, well, what does this mean to be a creature in relation to a divine creator? Well, his claim is that if we understand this in terms of our beginning, in terms of our having been created, we only have one horizon that we're looking toward, and that's death, an end. The beginning implies the ending. Now, the tragic conflict for us comes into play when we realize, right, that not only are we created and finite, but we also have this desire, this freedom. And this freedom always runs up against our limitations. We're in this kind of tragic situation. We want to be more than we are. We want to be more free than we are. And the only way to kind of come out of this tragic situation for Zizioulas is, as Telly said, communion with God. But to unpack that a little more, there's all kinds of ways we might be kind of tempted to solve this problem theologically by reconciling our createdness with God's uncreatedness. We can do this in any number of ways, right? What Zizioulas says is anytime we try to combine created reality with God's uncreated reality, you're going to end up going in one of two directions. You're either going to end up dissolving any distinction between creator and creature, which means that both things lose their definition. You can't just mix together, right, like a smoothie, all of God's uncreated attributes with our created attributes. It doesn't make any sense to talk about, right, createdness, eternal createdness, or uncreated finitude, or something like this. To bridge the gap, you have to introduce something that is more than either of these natures, divine being, created being. And for him, this is why salvation, our eschatological future, as opposed to our expiration date, our death, is only resolved in terms of a person, personal communion, right? If it was just, okay, well, now we have somehow dissolved into divine being through meditation, through contemplation, through any number of ways, then we're not creatures anymore. And God is not uncreated anymore. God is not God, and we are not creatures. For creatures to be creatures, freed from our tragic situation, in communion with God, requires that we remain creatures and God remains God. But to bring us into communion with God means that we have to introduce kind of this third term, the term of a person. In this case, the person of Christ, who is both God and creation in the same time, at the same time, in the sense that he has within himself both the distinction between creator and creature, and he's more than the distinction. So the distinction remains, but there's this point of identity that's deeper than the difference. And for him, this kind of irreducible uniqueness of the person is what allows us to escape the sameness of mortality, the sameness of finitude, the sameness of kind of the anonymous situation of all being products of our environment, of our circumstances. Something irreducibly unique comes into history and allows us not to escape it, but in some ways to exceed it without fleeing from it, I guess you could say. So I think the upshot of this whole chapter is if we view creation from this standpoint of communion with God, our kind of tragic situation doesn't disappear, but it becomes understood as a step on the way toward something that precedes our being born into the world, that precedes our natural end in death. And that is kind of revealed to us through the incarnation and the resurrection for him. So that's sort of my unpacking, I think, what Telly was laying out. I think all of this goes back to the ontological significance of the resurrection for him, is that it shows that there is a personal reality that exceeds the boundaries of all of our natural definitions. Not on our side only, but also on God's side. God is more than other from us, and we are more than other from God. So I'm going to hand it over. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No,
I
go
really
ahead.
appreciate that. And I think something with like for me with Zizioulas, right, is he writes in these really this conceptual framework. And I think sometimes that the beauty of what he's saying can get lost there's because he's making all these distinctions, right? And all of those distinctions really matter in his thought. So some of the kind of really beautiful points of this that I just want to draw on what you said, Jack, is that this communion with the uncreated is a gratuitous gift from God, right? Like he says here on 117, this gift of ever being, which is necessary for the protological being in order to be true being, is an eschatological gift. It will be granted at the great and common resurrection, which will give the grace of incorruption of nature to all creation together with the human being for whom it has been created. He also goes on to say on 119 that the fact of creation, creation's nature, does not guarantee or secure its being. In bringing about creation, God has inserted in its nature a power of survival, of overcoming the non-being from which creation came. But he continues on, right? He even says on 121, it is therefore necessary for creation to be in communion with the uncreated God in order to avoid extinction. And
Yeah.
what I really want to think about is this idea of this as an eschatological gift. And
Hmm.
that's that point you're making about the kind of pinning together of all of this, of being and non-being, is not just the incarnation, but actually the resurrection, which is our future, right? It is the future that God is
Hmm.
promising to us. Um, but also that like why I think this is so important is that the gift, like imagine what it would look like to live our lives seeing this eschaton, this communion as like this gift from all time into our not from all, and not to put time into it in like a way that, again, this is where the distinctions become hard because anything you say might be the wrong kind of distinction that he's making. What I mean is from all eternity, right? Or from our creation was always this gift of the resurrection, this eschatological gift. And so creation, when one of the really key points that he's making here is that this gift necessitates that creation and the eschaton is not just a return to Eden. We're not just simply going back. We were created to actually be more than what we were
Hmm.
created as. And that's
Hmm.
really key for Zizioulas throughout both of these chapters. That we're
Hmm.
not like we'll talk more about the fall and
Hmm.
what's going on there, but
Hmm.
we're not created just to go back to some like pre-fall state. We're created to actually transcend, and it is actually this eschatological gift of the resurrection
Hmm.
that leads us to this knowledge. And I don't know, I love thinking about, um, I just love that language. I love thinking about this as a gratuitousness of God.
Hmm.
And I think I'm pinning this here so that later when we get to his conversation around the fall, judgment, all of that, we can return to this idea of the gift because his entire understanding of who humans are, but also who is God? Who is
Hmm.
God in this?
Hmm.
God in this schema is not like some, you know,
Divine being,
yeah, he's not some divine, but did you
right?
say bully?
He's no divine being. He's not just this abstract
Yeah, he's a who.
collection of properties,
Yeah.
right?
God is a who bestows gifts, who is loving. I think about if you've seen Toy Story, there's that kid, Sid, who makes all those weird like versions of toys and like puts, like a doll's body on a truck. I don't know. I'm sorry. Maybe this is not the right crowd for this. But Toy Story is what I grew up with. Like God's not doing that. He's not just like, how sadistic can I be? Can I put this human's head on a cat and see what happens, right? No, like there's the gratuitous gift of our creation and then our becoming within that creation that is influenced always by the eternity of the resurrection of Christ.
Hmm.
And that is like thinking about who is God to you, right? Who do you say God is? Or Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? Like what an answer. Like it's so what he's doing here in all these categories is actually really beautiful. And I just didn't want to not highlight how, like, actually just gorgeous this theology is.
Before I kind of lose this thought, but you
Yeah.
brought this uh, up in me, Rachel. Another way of saying this is that outside of the personal encounter with the resurrected Christ, right? All of the, by definition, God and creation are incompatible,
Hmm.
right? They're in contradiction. God is eternal.
Hmm.
God is perfect. God is absolute, unchanging, right? Creation, finite, imperfect, propensity toward corruption. By definition, these are mutually exclusive realities.
Yeah.
But in the light of, right, an uncreated, created person, a human God, a God human raised from the dead, becomes the criteria by which we think about what it means to be a creature and what it means to speak of God. And if we start from the beginning standpoint with these abstract, from the beginning, right? We are created and there is a creator. There is no way to arrive at anything like the resurrection. You can only arrive at the fact that we're going to die and we came from somewhere. But if we look at the resurrection, kind of the whole terrain of these terms get changed by the kind of uniqueness of the person that somehow bridges all of these mutually exclusive
Hmm.
definitions.
Hmm.
That's all I
Hmm.
wanted to say. Yeah.
Well,
Hmm.
this idea of transcendence, though, too. I mean, I think the ethics, the eschatology and art section is really speaks to all these points, right?
Yeah.
Because there is a sense in which the artist attempts to transcend in some sense, right? I mean, there's a sense he has, just to clarify for everybody here, and again, if there are any questions on this particular point, creation, everything we're talking about, because we're going to switch over to the fall in a few minutes, please kind of write them in, but we can also deal with these questions even later too. So if they come to you later, please add them in. But he has this distinction between creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, and creation. I think it's et vetere, right, Jack? I think you know.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So that distinction is meant to convey a distinction. God's will. God is the only one who can will something out of nothing. Like there's nothing there. There's just God, right? But in creation, obviously, an artist always has something. I mean, I know there are a lot of theories of arts out there and things like that, but at least what Zizioulas is trying to convey is that the artist always has a certain kind of givenness. There's a certain kind of givenness that the artist has to deal with. And that givenness obviously is going to shape the kind of art that's going to be produced, right? You can't, I've made this point in other situations, but you can't have Picasso in the Renaissance, right? So there's a sense in which what's produced has something to do with context and a certain kind of givenness, a certain kind of surrounding, a certain kind of where you're at, a certain kind of. So, but at the same point, that at the same time, that givenness might imply that somehow the artist is bound by some kind of necessity, bound by some kind of restrictions. But in fact, the art is an act of freedom, an act of transcendence in and through the givenness, right? In and through the givenness, right? And but in and through that givenness, where something entirely new emerges, right? It's almost as if, I guess, maybe you could say, out of nothing. Because there is a kind of newness to it that's almost just as new and unique as God's creation of the world. But there's always a but with Zizioulas. There's always about with Zizioulas. So that sense of longing, that sense of creativity, that's how we're supposed to relate to creation creatively. Because through creation we can't be producers or facilitate this emergence of uniqueness and creativity. And also it's an indication of the longing of the artist to transcend. And the art is a reflection of the artist's, the art is a reflection of the artist's presence, but it's also a reflection of the artist's absence.
Mm-hmm.
Because the artist isn't always there next to the art. And I was just very, very fortunate enough to be at the Musée de l'Orange in Paris and saw Monet's Water Lilies.
Oh,
It's awesome.
amazing.
And it was really spectacular. But, I mean, Monet wasn't there. He was there, but he wasn't there. And one of the reasons why he wasn't there is, well, it's because he's dead. Death is that sameness, that irreducible, that sense of reducing to sameness. So the creation of art is also an indication of our freedom, of a manifestation of our personhood, our longing, irreducibility. But at the same time, it's a sign of the tragedy of our attempt to render ourselves unique through the givenness of our own created reality. In that sense, this is where so there's a kind of positive negative here. The creativity part of obviously is the positive part, but the negative part is death and non-being. But again, that somehow becomes saved, literally saved, through the kind of union we have with God through Christ. Rachel, you had a page number you wanted to highlight. I
Oh, I
saw
was
that.
just saying, in case folks were looking for this
Mhm.
section, that it just started on 148.
Oh yeah, 148.
Just,
Yeah.
in case people were following
Yeah.
along.
No, of course. Yeah.
That
So
was
what do
just
you say? I mean, what do you say? I think should we go on to the next chapter? Any maybe give like 30 seconds or any questions from the audience here on this particular? So maybe we should move on to you guys have any last thoughts about this?
there's just so much, but I think we
Mm,
could I'm okay moving on. At some point we should, during this book talk about the Eucharist. But it doesn't have to be
yeah.
right now.
I
Are
was
you
gonna say,
sure? Are you sure? I don't know. Does Zizioulas have anything to say about the Eucharist? I'm not sure.
about communion or yeah.
Communion, about the Eucharist.
Yeah.
Also,
Anyway, yeah.
there's this section, like, I think that if
Mm,
I were just to tie up part of this, um, that God is, and Zazula says in this chapter, he's arguing that, um, that part of this this creation that we're talking about, I just want to highlight that one, our foretaste of the eschaton is most like perfectly on earth witnessed in the Eucharist.
yeah.
However,
Mhm.
um he also is really clear that right, he says, for example, on 140, this makes the Eucharist the highest historical mode of the presence of all three persons of the Trinity in creation, not simply in the form of transmitting it to their common divine energies, but in the distinctiveness of each divine person's activities in the economy. But then he goes on right from there just to this pivot to eschatology and ecology, which we don't have to talk about, but I think it's important when we look at the fall, so just to transition us, that he's not talking only about an anthropocentric understanding of creation
Mhm.
and even like what it means to
Yeah.
be in the eschaton. he wants it to be human-centered insofar as we're priests of creation,
Right.
but it's not human-centered insofar as humans just get like sanctified and then everything else gets thrown out and doesn't matter. Like no, like all of creation really deeply matters.
Right.
Um
Right. Right.
and that includes all of creation in its relationship both to the fall creation and the eschaton. So I just wanted to kind of say those two.
Well, and that's not an uncontroversial move in the sense that making the humans the center in terms of creating a relational nexus within created reality that ultimately facilitates communion is not an uncontroversial move today. Because I think we don't have to go deep into this, but in terms of some theologies of ecology, making the human the center is seen more as perpetuating the problem.
I agree, and but also I
Yeah.
think that it is still much farther away from anthropocentrism than like
Hmm.
maybe something in the 19th and early 20th century might have been. So
Yeah, I
he's
agree with
still
that.
pushing quite far, I think also for Orthodox theology.
I do too.
He is really leading the thought on this.
Personally, I think he's right. I mean, and on this point,
Yeah,
I
I do
I
too.
don't know any other being that can ultimately either destroy or bring to beauty creation the way that potential of creation the way humans can. I mean, Dostoevsky has that great line for Ivan in the Grand Inquisitor. Um, he's talking about the Turkish soldiers shooting the baby, and right after that he says, "No animal could do that. No
Oh yeah.
animal could be so." And he uses the phrase "artistically cruel."
Hmm.
No animal could be so
Hmm.
artistically cruel. That's one of his best lines,
Yeah.
I think. Because it can go the other way too, because that's the point of the book, right? No other animal can also be as artistically can create such artistic beauty that you can see in people like Alyosha and Zosima. But we're a little bit off track here. So, in terms of the fall, chapter 3 now. So again, bare bones here, and then I'll let Jack and Rachel kind of take over. So again, Zizioulas, the common theme in Zizioulas is sort of like, he sort of surveys like how have people generally thought about this, and I'm going to tell you now, if we commit ourselves to this relational ontology, to this communion ontology, to this eschatological ontology, and they're all kind of synonymous, then we need to see the fall this way. That's basically what Zizioulas is doing,
Yeah.
right? Like there's in the history of Christianity, there's been all kinds of theories about everything. But if we're committed to this, and I've given you in the first few chapters why we should be committed to this, then you need to see the fall this way. And again, just to give it a bare bones approach here, there's a way of seeing the fall that we were created perfectly, absolute perfection. We blew it, and somehow we're trying to get back to that state of paradise perfection, whatever. So perfection of paradise. So we're trying to get back there. And Zizioulas, that's a very common way, of seeing the fall.
It's
And
Augustine's
also
way.
right, and also this
Yeah.
Augustine way that original sin has something to do with a kind of guilt that's perpetuated through birth, through inherited through birth, and so somehow we're all inheriting an existential guilt that baptism wipes away. And so, I mean, that's one theory. Zizioulas is saying that if you're committed to an eschatological ontology, which implies a ontology of personhood and a relational ontology, etc., then no, that's wrong. He's basically saying, right? We have to go what he would call the Irenaean route, which means that we weren't created perfectly. It doesn't mean that God's responsible for sin. It just means that
We're created.
We're created, right? We're created. And he uses the word imperfection, like imperfectly. We're just, I like the way Jack just said, we were just created, right? With maybe inevitable imperfections, right? Maybe inevitable. That doesn't necessarily mean we're made imperfectly, but we're made just, yeah. But I mean, the bottom line, though, for Zizioulas is that he kind of frames it as our sin is not so much taking our eye off of the past, right? In other words, that somehow, we were made perfect. We should be thankful for this past event, right? We want it to be God, and somehow we blew it and whatever, and we're still looking to the past, basically. For Zizioulas, our problem has always been from the get-go, from the beginning, from the eating of the fruit, etc., taking our eye off of the future, right? Taking our eye off what we're made to be, what we can be, what we could be, what God wants us to be. Taking our eye off of an eternal relationship with God, which ultimately is always future oriented. And in that sense, he wants to support the idea of the fall that really, again, comes from Irenaeus, in the sense that humans were created beings. I mean, Irenaeus uses a little bit more the metaphor of like little children who are ultimately bound to make mistakes. I don't remember Zizioulas doing that here, but he wants to ultimately give support to that in the sense that we are created beings, created oriented toward the future. We took our eye off of the future, which means that ultimately we're oriented towards created reality, which means that we are ultimately oriented towards death, because that's what's woven into created reality. And ultimately what Christ brings to us again is not simply a reorientation. Christ doesn't come and just simply say, hey, look to the future, Christ says, I am the future, right? So I don't know. Now, how your kind of intrusive thoughts come into your mind, like as you're talking and stuff like that. So I'm getting an intrusive thought here about the movie Back to the Future. I don't know, does this, I think that I feel that phrase applies here somehow.
Yeah.
Back to the Future, right? There's a sense in which, yeah. Jack, I'll let you're a good movie critic.
No, what I think is interesting to that point, before I think you're right about the movie title here. But the thing that I think is interesting about, right, so the claim that you're not starting with a pristine creation that gets deviated from. And so God is always sort of on the back foot trying to execute plan B to course correct the whole disaster, right? It's more that, and I think this is an interesting implication of the text, is that if to be created
that
means,
was really funny. Like, I mean, you have to think about that theologically. Like theologically,
what it
God's
would
like, wait,
mean.
well, like theologically, I think the eternal God, the simple God, is kind of like thinking, like, if this doesn't work out, what's my plan B?
What's my next option? I've made this perfect creation. Now, oh, I didn't foresee this going awry, so now I have to course correct it.
Lol,
I
whoops,
mean,
better kill my son.
I
Like,
know.
fuck that.
this whole kind of history becomes the fail safe to make
Yeah,
up the disaster.
yeah,
Whereas the implication here is that by being created, right,
right,
implies imperfection, change, instability, finitude, suffering to a certain extent, right? Um, the implication I think here is that we are still being created. We are still in the process of being made.
Mm,
because the purpose for which we were created, right, that precedes our creation is the resurrection. So if the purpose for which we're created is theosis, right? Again, if the paradigm of who God is and who the human being
Yeah.
is the God man, the God human, Jesus Christ, that means that the fall and all of the other kind of disasters of history are not necessary, but baked into the ongoing, he calls it the purification, right? The
Yeah.
sharpening of the iron in the fire that is basically that is always aimed at and purposed by the end as its beginning.
yeah. Can I just read a quote on
So
this really quick?
yeah, yeah.
So on 181, there's a key quote that I won't just want to read, just so we can hear his words a little bit. He says,
It's on.
"Our
I'm sorry,
work."
Rachel.
Sorry,
Hold on, Rachel. It's 181.
181.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Go ahead.
It
Yeah. Yeah.
starts at the like italicized part. Our origin was conditioned eschatologically right from the start.
Right from the start. Yeah.
We were created not simply in order to be, but also in order to become, to
Hmm.
pass through time and arrive at an end which surpasses in importance our beginning.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
going down, moving toward a future is built into our beginning. It is not a result of a fall from a paradise lost to which by a cyclical movement we should return. So I just
Interesting.
love this idea. I think I wish he used the word becoming more, but
Mm.
I'm glad he uses it here because this
Yeah.
idea of becoming is, like you're saying, Jack, this continuing to be made.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
if that's
Hmm.
if we're being in the process of being made, the fall is you might say, the error of trying to arrive at the end at the beginning. The
Yeah.
fall
Okay.
is this
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
is almost trying to prematurely bypass the fact of our being created to kind of reach our end on our own terms rather than on
Hmm.
God's terms. And so the kind of the incarnation, right, the restoration of creation, which is not only a historical moment, as he says, but also kind
Mhm.
of the core of reality itself, is, as you said earlier, Telly, it's the it's our back to the future. It's
Hmm.
our reorientation away from
Yeah.
trying to find our end in our beginning, right? I mean, Irenaeus says, right, the whole kind of temptation, right? Eat of this fruit and you will be like God. It's not that the serpent is lying.
Mm.
It's that
Sorry.
Right.
the
Right.
right. It's that the
Right.
serpent
Yeah.
is offering what is already the case, but with this sort of immediacy that doesn't have to undergo,
Hmm.
I don't know, the sharpening of becoming, right? The pain of growing toward what one is to become. And it's only kind of by the undergoing of, right, freedom running its course
Yeah.
through all of its iterations, the creativity running its course through all of its potential for disaster, whatever,
Yeah.
that really you have a creation that can freely acquiesce to
Really. Yeah. Hmm.
what it was made to be.
Right.
Otherwise, right, it's like it's sort of a seizure of our end before we're ready to have it. To attain the end, we have to almost suffer the beginning.
Mm.
And I
We-
mean that in
Yeah.
like the sense of pathos, like not in the sense of like
Yeah.
we have to undergo history in order to
And that
transcend it.
begins. and that begins with that's interesting because that begins with the eating of the fruit. In other words, it's almost, let's stay on this story for a little bit, right? Let's stay, because
Yeah.
the typical,
Yeah.
the typical, so now we're somewhat ad-libbing along with Zizioulas here, right? So theological improvisation. Here you go, everybody.
Yeah.
Theological improvisation. So you have like the typical interpretation of that passage, obviously, is, God says no, don't eat it, and they eat, and then they're banished, and etc. So, but there's just so much more to think about, I think, in the sense that, first of all, even after they eat the fruit, God doesn't say, you ate the fruit, I saw you, I'm the all-knowing God, and you didn't know I was the all-knowing God, and I caught you. God's actually
Right.
looking. God's actually looking for them, right? They're kind of hiding, and God's actually looking for them, right? And then God asks a bunch of questions, right? So the all-knowing God, supposedly the all-knowing God, is actually not saying, I know everything, I saw you. The all-knowing God is asking questions. Like, what's going
Yeah.
on here? Like, right? Like, how did you know you were naked, or something like that? But even more, the thing that challenges me quite a bit is, um, Eve was exercising her freedom in that sense, right? And if she didn't exercise it, that sense of curiosity, that sense of freedom, that sense of maybe daring, that sense of, you're right,
Yeah,
Jack. There would be no
risk. Yeah.
there'd be no history. There'd be no, in that sense, there wouldn't really be a way of, they had a communion with God, but there would be no way of really knowing the kind of communion with God that they could have after Eve did what she did, right? I guess I'm, so where am I going with this? I almost feel like, the story is written in such a way that God is kind of setting them up, right? It's almost as if God wants them to do it, through some kind of reverse psychology,
Or that
right?
there's
It's
an
almost as if,
inevitable, that feels Irenaean, right? That there's this,
Yeah.
there's inevitable curiosity or playfulness to the story, right? There's an
yeah, you put
inevitable,
kids in front of the stove,
okay.
right? And it's like, well,
Yeah,
I would prefer them not to touch the stove, but
right.
this
But
is a pedagogical
I want to say also, you put two kids in front of the stove and only told one of those kids not that the fire was hot. Okay, just I'm gonna rail on this till the end of time. Eve wasn't there.
mm,
Um, but I think
right,
that
right.
no one like what I struggle with in this paradigm, um, and it's not like it's not unsolvable. I just need to, I think might be helpful to work out, is that like the consequence of a wrongly defined freedom, right? So, like, let me just go back and explain what I'm about to say. So, like, Zizioulas says on 166, personhood finds these laws of nature to be provocative to its freedom, particularly if freedom is expressed and realized as love. The quote doesn't really matter what the context is, other than freedom, I think, in both Zizioulas and then obviously, like, in Maximos, and that's who he's pulling on as his most kind of used patristic or author, is this freedom of love, right? The freedom of being in communion.
Yeah,
So I don't want to be frivolous in talking about the incoming of history when, like, it isn't like, oh, good thing we got to, become more like God through history when, like, genocide is happening, and
yeah, sure.
like the Holocaust and like
No, sure.
you know what I mean? And I think like
yeah,
what I want to really push is that I think this only works. This system only works and doesn't just dismiss all bad things, right? Or doesn't take us off the hook, right, for our actions today,
Yeah.
in our becoming, if we understand that our freedom is to be exercised as love, and that our becoming is to be maturing toward, right, going from immaturity to maturity toward being like God and being in more deeper communion with God and others,
Yeah.
not in just like, oopsie,
Right.
didn't
Hmm.
call my congressperson about horrific things happening, right? Like, no, like you call them, like do the things, like be and
Hmm.
this distinction, like I don't Zizioulas, here, like we talked about in our first session, right, makes these distinctions between around ethics. And I think
Hmm.
he, in this book, is trying to not jettison ethics, but actually to capture it into the system so that it's not all just about like, be a good person, good moral teaching, right? It's about like
Right.
ontologically something is at stake here.
Yes. Yes.
But also
Ontologically. Hmm.
in this like understanding of the fall, I think ontologically something's at stake and ethically, right? For us today in our becoming, things are at stake. And I don't want us to lose that. And I'm not saying you were saying that.
No, no, no,
I
no,
just
no.
don't want us to lose it.
No, I'm with you. And I think that the distinction here, we talked about this a little bit last time too, I think. I think that when we're talking about, and this is a good kind of transition to sort of get to this stuff about judgment and the purification of history and so
Yeah.
forth that kind of ends these sections. But it's not, so he's not saying, in other words, that all of the catastrophes of history are necessary, right?
100%. Yeah.
It's not as though we had to undergo everything from the fruit, right, to be kind of allegorical about it, all the way up through, the atomic bomb or whatever, in order to then, you know, learn our lesson. It's not that this is a necessary, these aren't necessary evils ordered toward some kind of mechanical greater good. I mean, to go back to uh, Telly bringing up Dostoevsky, right? He's not saying that the kingdom of God is worth the price of the tears of an innocent child. He's not making that claim. But what I think he is saying is that those tears are redeemable.
Mm-hmm.
And they're redeemable not because they were necessary to get to the end, but that freedom can be redeemed despite itself. Finite freedom can, in some sense, be recovered from its untaught or intentionally radically evil refusal of communion with God.
Mm-hmm.
That redemption arrives not out of the necessity of evil, but despite evil. And that gratuity of redemption can only come at the end. And the passage I have in mind here that I think summarizes kind of what he's doing and sort of what we've been talking about with his way of, I mean, I know we often talk about how the sort of chronological reading of the fall is sort of the standard one, right? We
Hmm.
begin with a perfect beginning and then there's the fall and then, plan B comes into play and all that. But Zizioulas does a really good job, I think, of bringing out the fact that that is really not how the fathers read that text.
Yeah.
Augustine is sort of an outlier in reading the text chronologically. Maximus, Irenaeus, they all sort of read.
Even as early as Saint Ephraim. There's a
Yeah, I
return,
mean,
but it's like a going beyond.
yeah, and so this passage on 187 top paragraph,
Hmm.
he says, this isn't, actually, I'll start a little bit before on the bottom of 186. If the position argued here is to be accepted, did God create an imperfect world and an imperfect humanity? How could the absolutely perfect being bring about an imperfect creation? This is an old question, but those who would answer it by proposing a protological perfection of creation and humanity would do so by disregarding two fundamental aspects of Christian. of Christian doctrine of creation. The first has to do with the importance of history. If everything was perfect from the beginning, history would have been meaningless or even a fall from perfection. The Irenaean doctrine that humanity had to grow to perfection instead of being perfect from the start invests time and history with a significance that was absolutely necessary not only to refute Gnosticism, but also to be faithful to the biblical faith and the Judeo Christian mentality. The other aspect of the Christian doctrine of creation that must be taken into account when we speak of creation, of a perfect world and humanity, is even more important. The perfection of creation and humanity is to be found in the incarnation of Christ, a little bit further down. By creating the world in Christ and for Christ, God created a perfect world. Indeed, as it befits the supremely perfect being, but as the supremely perfect loving being that he also is, God entrusted the perfection of his creation to his image, i.e., to the human being, granting it freedom.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that passage because I think our conversation has actually been more textual than it might seem.
Well, and we do have a question, and so please send us your questions. We have about 20 minutes left.
Yeah.
Send your questions because otherwise, then Jack, Rachel, and myself, Jack, Rachel, and I could just keep going on forever and ever. But
Amen.
but I think the Irenaean way that Zizioulas is trying to highlight lends itself more to seeing the fall as a breaking of communion, right? And seeing the fall rather than as a kind of like, I gave you a rule, you guys were all happy, you broke the rule. Now my punishment is to put you in a place that's not so happy and you have to come back to it, right? It doesn't, that interpretation doesn't really account for other parts of the story, right? It doesn't account for why God is looking for them, why God is asking questions, why Adam is the first one he asks, right? And then the ripple effect of how Adam then blames Eve and then he blames the serpent, right? There's no sense of freedom there in the sense that there's an opposite. In other words, there's active freedom in terms of the fruit, but there's almost a sense of a lack of responsibility, one could say.
Yeah.
Which is an exercise of freedom in a certain kind of way. And that lack of responsibility is a breaking of communion, right? There's a sense in which it's like a domino effect, right? Like you did one thing and you had a chance to restore the communion by just being honest, right? And that accounts a little bit more for why the all-knowing God is asking questions, looking for them. You know, it just accounts for more parts of the story, right? I mean, God is basically giving you a chance here to just fess up, you know, to accept responsibility, to say my bad, right? And so God is just that's you know that's a central part of the story in that sense. There's a breaking of communion. So you're outside the gates, you know, and in a way you're kind of and you have to work at it, you know, and now it's a matter of that the more you do that, the more you have to work at it. The more you have to kind of work at restoring. And that's just true to life, right? The more mistakes we make, the more bad decisions we make, that could lead to things like addiction or betrayal or other kinds of things. You know, the more we make, the more we do that kind of thing, the deeper or the farther away maybe we are from the gate. I don't know, to use the continued metaphor. In that sense, that makes much more sense of the fall, I think, and of just human life. Which makes baptism again this reincorporation into a body, into a community that ultimately is trying to move towards the future again, right? Is trying to and is given sort of the grace, but it's still work. right? It's still work that you have to do. So
Mhm.
that's. Do you guys want to comment on that, or maybe do a question? Should we do the question?
Yeah, let's get some questions.
Is the
I
biblical
did want to
narrative?
note, sorry,
Oh,
sorry, one
yeah. Go
second.
ahead.
I
No, go.
just want
No.
to note that Valerie, just because when we answer them, they pop off the screen. Valerie said that what your exegesis is what Chrysostom says in his homilies on Genesis. So I just wanted to
Excellent.
add that.
Excellent. Thank you, Valerie. So, is the biblical narrative of the fall a contrast between what Zizioulas asserts as active passivity before God, as the expression of freedom, and what might be the passive activity of Adam in simply accepting the food and eating? It's a good question. I haven't really thought about it. So I have to think about it a little bit. That's a really good question. I haven't really thought about that.
I think to tease it out a little more, when Zulus is talking about active passivity, I think he's talking about, to put it a little bit differently, the way in which, as creatures, we desire more than being creatures. So there's this way in which we have this, I mean, desire is a kind of active passivity, right? It kind of befalls you,
Mm.
but it's something that you that drives, right? Like an engine almost. And right, the tragic situation is that we're oriented toward God, but unable to reach God by virtue of our nature, of our being created, right? And I think the sin, right, as kind of we were saying before, right, is that it attempts to kind of prematurely or naturally take hold of what we are in fact created to desire, but uh, without the history that allows us to exceed what we are capable of having, right? Which is to say, trying to bypass the incarnation to get to God. Um, yeah, so all that is to say, yeah, I think that distinction is kind of what he's getting at.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, uh, the way I read Zizioulas in terms of passivity is often in the sense that the eschatological kingdom breaks through, right? And there's a sense in which we are there to experience it, receive it, right? Um, we can only take it in
Mm,
to some
yeah.
extent, right? We can only kind of take it in, kind of absorb it, let it work on us somehow. Allow it allow it to let us be incorporated. Um, the active part, right? The active passivity. The only thing I could think of with Zizioulas, he doesn't really have a very strong sense of. I mean, he doesn't deny it. He doesn't really develop it, right? He doesn't really develop uh, asceticism, right? And when I talk about
Yeah.
asceticism, I'm not really just talking about the monks of Mount Athos. Or I mean, I think that we're engaging in our asceticism every day, right? There's a certain
Mm.
we're always doing some kind of discipline or something to work on ourselves or whatever. I mean, that's a very broad understanding of what asceticism. Um, so there is a certain kind of activity there in terms of that, and I guess I honestly don't know. Maybe you guys can help me with this. I'm not really sure if Zizioulas means this by this, but what I see as active passivity is we do things, right? We are active, right? We engage in certain kinds of disciplines, perhaps prayer, perhaps good deeds, self-reflection, you know. There's a certain kind of active an exercise of our freedom, and especially in hopefully in ways that
Mm.
are creative, right? That are creative. the way Zizioulas talks about. But that that transformation that occurs through grace, through relationships, through communion, through the Eucharist, is something only that we can receive or absorb, right?
Mm.
But I like to see that activity part as providing the conditions that would allow us to receive what's already there.
Yeah.
That's how I see active passivity.
Yeah.
I'm not actually 100% sure what Zizioulas means by it. And I've been studying it for a long time, so I don't actually really know what he means by it. So is there a page number for that, or
That's what I was gonna ask because I know I
Hold
saw
on.
it. I know I have it marked, and I like cannot
yeah,
find it.
maybe the person who asked the question can direct us to the page number. In the meantime, Barbara Anderson has given us she's a friend and colleague from Fordham University. Thank you, Barbara, for being online in support of our center. Phyllis
Oh
Tribal
yeah,
is
yeah,
in a groundbreaking essay on the fall describes Adam as passive and Eve as more likable for her human curiosity, wanting to learn. I totally agree with that. I
yeah.
agree with
And that's actually
Yeah.
that's in the
that.
Orthodox tradition,
Yeah.
especially in Mary's recapitulation of Eve. So one of my favorite examples is
Mhm.
that so like sometimes Mary is seen as recapitulating Eve by just saying
Mhm.
yes, right?
Yeah.
But in a lot of our hymns, so for example, in the Akathist, I think the joy of all who sorrow, and then also in some Syriac like dialogue hymns, how Mary recapitulates Eve is by just asking Gabriel a bunch of questions to the point, and he doesn't answer them at first, and then gets like really like afraid of her in the biblical
Mhm.
sense, like when someone says like an angel's like, do not be afraid, he is afraid. And actually it says, oh, I better answer her. And the idea is that she questions him so much. She's like, I am not going to get tempted, and act so actually Eve's sin, quote unquote, her sin is more that she didn't argue enough and didn't use her freedom enough. And
Mhm.
Mary just completely grills Gabriel and is like, "How does this work? What's going to happen? Tell me more." And I think that's really interesting to think about. I completely agree. I love this essay by Phyllis Tribble. I think like the first time if you ever read this essay, it's like the first time you read it, you're like, oh my gosh. Um, but actually, so Eve is more active. And then in the Eastern tradition, Mary is even more active on top of that
Yeah.
activity, asks even more questions, is even more aggressive. And really makes Angel Gabriel afraid. And I just really love that tradition that we keep within our tradition of this questioning and this freedom within
Mhm.
the fall and also within the incarnation, recapitulating that not as meekness, but actually as even more
Yeah.
assertiveness.
That's
Actually,
got yeah.
Zizioulas alludes at the Mariological dimension of all of this at the end of the second appendix to this chapter, which I thought was
Hmm.
interesting,
Do you
where
have
he
a
uses,
passage there?
yeah, it's the
What page?
very
What page?
page 215. So I'll just, the bottom paragraph says, by making creation move toward perfection, i.e., by granting it a history
No.
and calling us to lead this process in freedom, which I take the earlier question about active passivity to relate to this.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Yeah.
God
Yeah. Yeah.
elevated humanity to the highest point of dignity in the whole universe. This, of course, involved a risk for creation, as the fall has so tragically shown. But risk is inevitable where there is freedom and love. And
Right.
God
Yeah.
places freedom, a quality of his own being, so high that even in restoring after the fall the movement to the eschatological perfection through the incarnation, he sought the ascent of human freedom, which was given in the person of the Theotokos.
Yeah.
Might this not be the reason behind the delay of the parousia
Yeah.
too?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really a pretty great passage, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. The freedom part is, and that's also echoing Dostoevsky, the Grand Inquisitor. You know,
Yeah, very much so.
you overestimated human beings and their freedom because you wanted a love that is free, right? And
Yeah.
that's it. such a great line.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, connecting that to the active passivity part. But but getting back to the story too, I mean, Adam just comes off badly in the story in the sense that he's like, "Hey, try the fruit," and he's like, "Sure, why not?" And there's no, and then
He
and
does.
then God's
Relatable.
and then
In in
and then God's
fairness.
and then God's like, "Hey, what's going on here?" And he's like, "Well, I didn't do it. She did it. She did it. She made me do it." He just like, comes off pretty badly in the story,
Yeah, he's kind of a wimp.
a little bit.
He's a little
Yeah,
bit. He doesn't.
yeah.
He's not being a theologian as he should be. He should be investigating and thinking through and not just, you know,
He's the thinker. At least, at the very least, he's the thinker.
For sure.
That could go
For
um
either
sure.
way. I mean, that could go either way. People might pick up on that and say, "Oh, see, rationality is bad. Reason is bad."
Right, yeah.
there's always something. But actually what I think is interesting is that ties us into one of the last sections on the purification of history is just this idea of like what does it mean to like
You're good.
purify history, right? And this whole
Yeah,
point of even like in that instance where they're just kind of Adam and Eve each are pointing, right? And I just want to say like Adam and Eve like sorry, like I also do this. So like just to like not just only point to them. I also am the queen of being like someone else made me do this, right? So I think
right,
this is
right.
a human instinct. I don't want to
Yeah.
only put it on our two
Well, that's the point of the story. Yeah.
I don't want to only put it on them. But he says that, on 200, he says, through the very act of resurrection and the abolishment of death, the last judgment becomes crisis, in the double meaning of the term, discernment or separation and condemnation. He then goes on to say, last judgment is a cosmic event, and he's identifying this with the resurrection itself. He says, um,
Hmm.
he says, the last judgment will not be seen as a vindictive, but a healing act of God, a purification of the entire creation from evil. The
Hmm.
presentation of the last judgment, mainly as a condemnation of sin and an act of punishment, overlooks the cosmic dimensions of evil and the restorative and reconciliatory character of the eschatological act of God.
Hmm.
I just love this idea that like part of the
Yeah,
key even to the fall could have been
yeah.
reconciliation
Yeah.
Yes.
and
Yeah,
restoration, right? It
yeah,
could have been
yeah.
like, oh, sorry, I didn't tell you to not eat the fruit. Oh, sorry, I gave you the fruit. And like, I
Mm,
don't know that
mm.
it's as simple as that, but just there's a beauty in thinking about this purification of history, not as what is that quote by Wesley? The joy of the saints is to watch the sinners burn. Like
Oh,
that
jeez.
is not that is not what Zizioulas is saying, right?
That's like
Um,
James. That's like James Joyce in the
I was gonna say
portrait
the portrait
portrait
of
of
the
an
artist.
artist
Yeah.
as a young man. The sermon that the Jesuit gives, and yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
so I
Yeah,
think there's this like reconciliatory sense and that like it is Christ in both the incarnation, but then more even so, the resurrection and our participation in the resurrection and the resurrection being the end of death, which is an end of communion, right? So the resurrection
yeah,
being this ultimate event of restoration of communion
yeah.
and this ultimate event of becoming irreducibly unique and becoming fully human, right? And so
Right,
full
right,
is a negation, right? There's no
right,
negations in there anymore. We're full. There's something
right.
really beautiful to thinking about this um becoming in this way and this purification. I don't know that I like that word, but I understand where he's getting at.
Right.
He could have read one feminist author and not use the word purification, but it's okay. We still love him. I'll still restore with him, hopefully one day. If I am so worthy, not that's not a comment on him. Um,
Mm,
but I think that there's a real like positive understanding of what it means to become and to become like God and in communion with God. So I didn't want to forget this purification of history part here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we are at time.
Perfect segue to next time.
Yeah,
Woo!
excellent segue. We have chapters 4 and 5. So we are going to finish the book. Eschatology, hell, and final judgment. And then eschatology and liturgical time. Because I think what he's going to say is that in the end, whatever the eschaton is, it's one long eternal liturgy.
Great. We already have enough of those.
Cosmic liturgy.
Just kidding. Please don't
I know.
excommunicate me.
I know I won't. No, it's gonna be beautiful music. So there'll be a good choir. So but thank you for joining us. Don't forget that you have to sign up for the last session. And of course, you probably know by now, for those of you who have registered and attended, that you're getting a preview recording of these sessions. They'll all be dropped on YouTube eventually. And again, many thanks to Sebastian Press for not only making this book available to our participants, but just the way they've collected so much of Zizioulas' work, including his sermons. So that's kind of key as well. And I think that's it. I think visit Public Orthodoxy and our center. Make sure you like everything so you can change the algorithms. And thank you all very, very much. We'll see you next week for the Transfiguration, for the very last session. Yeah, have a good week and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.